So as mentioned, my name is Marc Brouillard. I'm the CTO for the Government of Canada, and I'm leading the transformation of the GC's IT infrastructure environment. And this is in support of the digital transformation. So you've probably heard this a lot, but we have a lot of push about transforming to more modern, more agile ways of doing things, being very user-centric. And IT infrastructure, and specifically cybersecurity, are there as critical components to support that journey. So I'm here today to speak to you about the business of tomorrow, where we're going, and the Government of Canada's journey to zero trust. You gotta love the headlines. There's no shortage of them. And I'm sure, like us, every time you see a new headline or your deputy sees a new headline, you get a phone call, you get an ask for a briefing. It's a constant evolution. The cyber breaches don't stop. The bad guys don't stop. The threat is asymmetric. We have to patch every hole. We have to find every vulnerability. They only have to find one. So it's a constant battle. Technology keeps evolving, and organizations are still struggling to do basic hygiene. We are dealing with a massive legacy infrastructure, aging IT infrastructure, while we're trying to do digital transformation, while we're trying to modernize, and provide better service to Canadians. So it's a very complicated landscape, and it's ever-changing. With the rise of cloud computing, software as a service applications, and mobile devices, company systems and workforces are no longer confined to the office or the data center. The fact is, breaking down the walls of the traditional perimeter-based security methods, where trust is determined purely by being on the inside or the outside, no longer work. As we've seen from the numerous cyber attacks that have made the news on a regular basis, once an actor gains privileged access inside our walls, they have free reign. And oftentimes they can go on undetected for long periods of time. In addition, there's an increasing burden on cybersecurity professionals, yourselves. The adversaries can focus nearly endless resources and use commercially available or easily to obtain tools to gain access or to try to gain access to our networks. We are endlessly trying to patch, watch what's happening on the network, implement new tools, and all with limited and often diminishing returns. This is not a sustainable model. We need a new model. The old walls don't work. Traditionally, this has been a castle and moat approach. We build perimeters. We focus a lot on securing the perimeters. And once a breach occurs, once they're in the perimeter, we often lose visibility. These traditional security architectures were built with two groups in mind: the trusted individuals, those who are allowed to access data inside the organization, and untrusted individuals that are meant to be kept on the outside. A very us and them approach. So security and IT teams invested in defensive systems that protected the barrier between them, focusing heavily on security of network perimeter, basically often relying on firewalls with increasing complexity and challenges to maintain. While they were successful in building a wall between potential threats and the safety of the corporate ecosystems, this full trust model is problematic because when the perimeter is breached, an attacker has relatively easy access to everything on the company's privileged intranet, and not to mention the havoc an insider threat can pose without even having to breach the perimeter. The thinking that the four walls of a company were protected, then threats would be neutralized before they come anywhere near our core IT infrastructure is false. The advent of bring your own device, mobile devices, cloud computing, and API accessible systems has blurred those traditional barriers and made the environment even more complex. Additionally, adversaries continue to find creative methods of getting around perimeter security, such as social engineering attacks that manipulate users into giving away their credentials. We've all seen this: phishing attacks, social engineering. The user is often the weakest link, and yet once the perimeter has been breached, we have no visibility into that. The network expansion and adversary creativity requires increasing numbers of firewalls with complex inspection specifications, which is cost-intensive and with diminishing returns. Not to mention the impact this has on the performance of our networks and the impact on the user experience. Perimeter security rapidly devolves into a game of whack-a-mole, where firewalls must constantly be adjusted to account for an expanding set of authorized entrants into the network and acceptable traffic in and out of the network. These firewalls will frequently duplicate efforts, creating burdensome and costly infrastructure that is largely ineffective, and also very hard to debug when we have to find problems. At the same time, privileged users with access to large numbers of systems and their high-value information have become an obvious point of attack, and their identities and credentials are under constant threat. Unfortunately, with these realities, keeping malware out of our enterprise environment is a losing battle. So where do we want to go? In a cloud and mobile world, more people want access to more resources and data from more devices and locations than ever before. The increasing adoption of mobile technologies has resulted in a remote workforce where work is increasingly done outside the corporate network. The rise of cloud-connected, mobile, and remote workforces has shifted visibility and control of users and devices outside the enterprise. Services and assets today aren't contained inside your perimeter. Organizations are purposefully extending themselves, opening up the traditional enterprise barriers. And we're driving this change. The principle of government as a platform is all about enabling better integration, API access to systems, blurring the boundaries between what a government system is and what a service is delivered to Canadians. So this is not going to slow down, and in fact, it's going to get more and more complicated. So security versus user expectations. This is a constant balancing act for security practitioners, protecting the assets, but also enabling the users. If you go too far one way, you lock your network down too much and encourage user workarounds. If you go too far the other way, you don't have adequate protections. We always said the most secure network is one with no users, but not quite as useful. Users want to have access to information and services from wherever we are, using whatever platform we choose. As service enablers, we have an increasing duty to be responsive and provide a solution that meets the changing expectations. As security professionals, we need to balance the service expectations with appropriate safeguards to protect the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of those services and supporting information systems. As an enterprise, we need to apply smart rules to ensure fair and balanced access to services. We have to apply risk-based methodologies. And ultimately, we need to adopt a balanced approach that considers user needs, supported by a pragmatic security approach, resulting in more secure environments. So what does that look like? I love this slide. Fundamentally, we can put all the security controls we want in place. Users will find a way around. They will find a way to get the job done. So we have to understand what the user perspective is. Security needs to get out of the no business and into the yes business. In fact, this is our #1 digital standard. You must design systems with the user in mind. This doesn't just apply to UX, UI design, application development. It also applies to security controls. When you implement a security control, understand how it impacts the user. Understand how the user is likely to react. And adapt. Make it useful for them. Make it so that it's invisible to them, while protecting the information assets that you're trying to protect. Doing security for the sake of security doesn't always work. And in fact, putting a control that forces the user outside of the box is actually lowering the security of your systems. We all went through this 10, 15 years ago, complex security passwords, password resets, not allowing repeats of passwords. These were perceived to increase the security of those passwords, and yet what did they do? They drove users to writing them down on sticky notes and putting them under keyboards. This was effectively a reduction of the security posture by implementing more security. So, at the end of the day, it's your responsibility when you implement a control to ensure you understand what the impact is of those controls on the user base. Also making sure that they're measured and they're appropriate to the risk level that you're trying to protect. So the new paradigm shift is the transformation to zero trust, where we take the old perimeter and we break it apart and include many more devices and networks that have access. Most enterprise security models have tended to employ a verify then trust method, which means if someone has the correct user credentials, they are admitted to whichever site, app, or device they are requesting, and they have full access. This model doesn't work in today's business climate, and as a result, many organizations have been subject to malware and ransomware attacks and data breaches that have impacted their brands and their bottom lines. In today's new threat landscape, building a strong perimeter based on a hierarchical network design is no longer an effective approach to security. Notions of trust but verify are outdated and extremely vulnerable to a plethora of cyber attacks. Cybercriminals have found a multitude of ways to infiltrate what walls we have built, sometimes using malicious insiders in positions of trust on your network, whether willingly or unwillingly. Once they have those advanced credentials, they have free reign. So we need to reassess the current method of perimeter security and are considering new methods such as zero trust, which can drive a step change in security improvements across our networks. Zero trust security is an architectural model for network security that is guided by the principle of never trust and always verify. Zero trust moves away from the perimeter approach and instead assumes, what the name would suggest, that the network is assumed compromised. Imagine building an application security model where you assume that there was zero other security on that network. There were zero firewalls, there were zero other credentials. Is that application still secure? That's the level of trust we need to get to. We need to provide mechanisms to automate and manage granularity of access controls, prioritize protection of data and information as core assets, enable ease of access for users who are transparently provided a level of trust based on established policies, and take advantage of investments already being made in an enterprise where we can build platforms that provide services to improve security functions. By assuming that the network is compromised, security can take a more nuanced approach by guarding access to the resources within the network and building strong authentication and authorization standards to allow specific access based on user and device-specific attributes. Zero Trust operates on a least privileged access model by only granting users and devices access to the applications, services, and data that are absolutely necessary for their role within the organization. So for all my GC colleagues, how many of you are in organizations where you have provisioning systems that automatically react to HR events, such as someone getting transferred to another department? Does anyone have that? So automatically we know that events are taking place, changes are taking place to the needs to access the network and the systems on it, and there's no real-time controls that monitor that. So automatically we know that there are people that have access that no longer require it. We need to address those issues and make sure that only the people who have a need to know and a need to access are granted roles on the systems. Zero Trust moves us to a more data-centric approach, protecting data as the core asset while also ensuring ease of access, transparency to users. So in our target state, we would have a balance of protection and availability of GC data across the network, requiring mechanisms that ensure access is granted only upon a verified trust of both the device and the user. Context matters. The user may have the right credentials, but if they were in Ottawa this morning and China this afternoon, that's probably a flag. If they were working from a trusted device and now no longer have a trusted device, that may be a change in the risk posture. Being able to react to those changes in the ways that users are accessing the systems is critical to providing enhanced security. All access to GC resources would be completely authenticated, authorized, and encrypted. Granular controls of GC resources would be wholly enforced, and the end result would allow clients to work securely from any location. So what are some of the principles of Zero Trust? The network is always assumed to be hostile. Always assume that there are threat actors on your network. External and internal threats exist on the network at all times. Network locality is not sufficient in deciding trust for a network. Assume that someone may have compromised that location. Every device, user, and network flow is authenticated and authorized. Understand what the flows should be. What is the normal pattern of operation? There are some very, very basic controls that can be put in place just by using logic of saying, this system is accessed by this group of people from this location, and there's really no need for anyone outside of that pattern to access it. Put a control in place that notifies you if someone tries. It may be a valid use case, but it may also be an indicator of a threat. And then policies must be dynamic and calculated from as many sources of data as possible. So again, looking at the signals, looking at the ability to gather the information that we have now on how people are accessing our networks and our systems allows us to significantly increase our detection of anomalies. So these are the Forrester's 5 steps to zero trust. First and foremost, identify your sensitive data. This has to be the core of what we are doing. It's the raison d'être for security. It's not to protect access, it's to actually protect the data doesn't go into the hands of people that shouldn't have it. So implementing classification systems, data loss prevention systems, even using AI to do auto-classification, recognizing documents and data structures that have sensitive information. There's a lot of technology in this space. This is critical to providing real-time analysis of the behaviors that are occurring on the network and being able to prevent them. Second, map the flows of your sensitive data. Again, as I just mentioned, understanding what are the usage patterns and where they're diverting from the normal, and at least raising a flag. You may not want to stop them. You may want to allow for variety, for flexibility, but at least understanding that something abnormal has happened, and that way you can look at it and you can adjust. Architecting your zero trust micro perimeters. So again, assuming the application level security is the only level of security on the network. You wouldn't do that actually. You would have obviously more perimeter controls, more network security, routing. But at the end of the day, how many applications in our zoned model have access to data zones where all of your databases live? This doesn't make sense if the application only ever talks to one database. So micro-zoning and the ability to have flexible software-defined zoning gives you not only the opportunity to increase the security, but it gives you the flexibility to move those applications around without having to completely re-architect the security model. Continuously monitoring your zero trust ecosystem with the security analytics and embracing security automation and orchestration. So looking at SIMs, looking at building able to build correlation and extract threat patterns so you can implement new controls. The cloud is a huge opportunity to start working in this direction. In the cloud, you can turn on a firewall, you can activate software-defined networks, you can try new things all at the push of a button. You don't have to buy new hardware, run a pilot, put it in a lab, see what happens. You can do that virtually in the cloud environment very quickly and learn what works and what doesn't. Also, working with the business to create these relative controls is important. The business owners will understand what those behaviors should be and shouldn't be, and they can give you valuable insight on how to design these micro-perimeters. So the outcome is now contextual. We talked about verifying the user, giving access based on what we know about a user at that point in time. Are they still employed in the organization? Have they changed jobs? Has their role changed? You need to be able to have those signals. Identity is the new perimeter. It really comes down to who is trying to access what. We have several initiatives, both internally and externally, that are trying to improve this. ICAM, privileged access management. These are all things that are going to give you tools at an enterprise level that you'll be able to implement to better manage your identity, your user's identity. Then validating the device, device-based identities, security tokens, host-based protection, application whitelisting. These are all things that can control the behaviors of the applications and minimize the risk that malware gets installed and does things that it shouldn't do. Then determining trust. That's really about dynamically putting all of these information signals together and assessing at that point in time from that location for that user what access permissions they have. We've seen this in the new Microsoft Office 365, where you'll be able to assess the level of permissions granted based on whether the user is coming in from their laptop or their mobile phone, from within the network, or from Starbucks. You'll be able to make decisions that are contextual and much more relevant to the real security threats. And then finally, learn and adapt. Always be modifying. Don't expect this is a one-stop journey. It's a continual evolution. So make sure you're inspecting the traffic, looking for patterns, and adapting to what could be perceived threats. And as I mentioned earlier, working with the users, understanding their patterns of behavior, and adapting to what makes sense for them. There's no value in a control when the users are going to try to work around it. They become your threat vector. So understanding that process is critical. Relevant initiatives in that space as well include the Security Operations Center and the SIM initiative, which are really going to provide more data, more useful analytics to be able to better understand what's happening on our networks. So I'll talk a little bit about what the GC is doing. This slide builds. There we go. So we have the Digital Operations Strategic Plan, which is the strategy for the Government of Canada across all of these different pillars, I will say. Service and user-centric, number one. Open and collaborative, accessible by design, digitally enabled delivery are the pinnacle of what we are trying to deliver to the end user. But how do we enable that? So we need modern technology and information stewardship, we need digitally enabled public service, and we need good digital governance. And to support that modern technology, we need to be secure and trusted. So we need to build trusted access. This is the federated identity process, both internally for our GC employees, by giving them true single sign-on across the entire enterprise, as well as access for Canadians, so they can access services and not have to understand who's delivering the service, what the organizational structures look like. They can access it with one identity. In fact, they can access it with their provincial identities or even their bank identities. This is an ability to provide more user-centric, more user-friendly services while not compromising our security. Protecting our assets, so shifting to an information-centric security model to protect the data as the critical assets. This is a critical shift in the way we approach security and is very, very important to understanding that we're protecting what's actually important. We are owned by the people. Everything we do is by the people. So that's why we have ATIP, that's why we have open and transparent. Most of what we do is actually discernible. It can be provided through ATIPs, can be provided on open government. So it's really understanding what are those critical pieces that are not subject to that. And there are some, and there are some very important ones. We protect the privacy of Canadians. We have national security. These are all critical pieces of information that we have to make sure we are ever vigilant of. But if you can get rid of 90% of the concerns by identifying it as low risk and focusing on what is really important, you're going to be able to focus your resources much more effectively on what matters most. And then resilient services, secure and trusted digital services that require systems and applications to be built with resiliency and security by design. So you should be at the table on day one of the project, not on day, go live -1. It's necessary that we consider security by design from the beginning, especially in a zero trust model, where building in that security capability, the provisioning of user roles directly into the functionality of the application becomes critical to providing that full security picture. So some of the key projects that we're working on, Sign in Canada, which is the means of giving every Canadian access to government services as a platform. But more importantly, it means that we break down the silos between our organizations. Canadians can come in to canada.ca, get validated, go from ESDC to CRA to VAC to ISED, and be able to move between those systems without having to get re-authenticated. The tokens can get passed in the back end, that authentication can be verified, and we can provide systems that allow for increased verification when needed. So if you move from a system of low authentication to one of high, you can be prompted for multi-factor authentication, as an example. This is a way of providing a much more user-centric experience, actually increase the security posture, and make it invisible to users and easier for governments to implement. GC Pass is the same concept, but on the inside. So we're working very closely with Shared Services Canada to provide a federated identity model where we're actually going to be able to have systems that recognize identities between departments and the ability to do multi-factor authentication to increase our levels of assurances when people are logging in. Administrative access control services as well is an absolute critical piece that we're working on, because we know that these are the administrative accounts, held by many of you, I assume, that are the most vulnerable. The accounts where, if compromise does take place, the most damage can get done. There's always going to be the need for the root account. There's always going to be the need for the accounts that have very high level of access to manage and monitor our systems. So we need to make sure we pay particular attention to protecting those and making sure that if there is a compromise, that we're able to segment and minimize the loss. Network device authentication, so ensuring all GC furnished equipment has a trusted device certificate to enable network access control. This isn't just to provide increased security internally, but it also provides better service to the users by actually allowing a user in one department to log on to a network in another department and get access not to that department's network, but to my home network. So we can provide much more flexibility and service with some of these technologies. Endpoint visibility, to ensure that all of our assets are visible. We understand what the threat to patching or lack thereof is to the network and can react in a much more specific way if we know where the threats are. Secure cloud enablement and defense. This is making sure that we have secure connectivity to the cloud for our internal workloads, our protected B workloads. This is going to allow us to treat the cloud in many instances as a virtual extension of our networks and start to enable and take advantage of some of the advanced security models that are available in the cloud. If you're not familiar with the AWS model, I'd highly recommend you take a look at it. Their entire infrastructure, the entire AWS cloud, is API driven. Everything can be automated. Everything can be visible. You can really build a robust set of technologies that monitors the activities and enables the controls you need to protect that environment. And lastly, the SIM, redesigning our SIM architecture to meet enterprise security logging requirements as a whole, and providing services not just to the security professionals, but to a more comprehensive set of users that can start to understand the activities that are taking place on our network. So what are the outcomes that this is going to lead to? Truer mobility, the ability to log in and do work from anywhere on any device is really becoming a user expectation. Everyone carries around a mobile smartphone that gives you full access to everything you need to do in your daily lives. Why shouldn't that include your work? Reducing the time to breach detection, so being much more flexible, much more nimble, much more agile in detection and reaction times. Reducing the complexity, trying to take down the walls of all the firewalls and all the security controls that are a nightmare to maintain and once breached, ineffective. So by providing a more granular micro perimeter model, you're going to be able to not only maintain security posture, but provide more flexibility to your user community. Greater security capacity through consolidation. Again, focusing on those critical information assets and not having to worry about the things that are inconsequential. Adaptive security based on context, so auto provisioning, dynamic role provisioning, and the ability to react to the information signals that you're getting on the network. And lastly, the confidence to trust that the network is providing the security we need at all times based on the fact that it's, what do we call it? Never trust, always verify. So fundamentally, we're providing users the services they want in the most efficient way possible while providing the right security levels commensurate to the current risk levels. So it's not about a one-size-fits-all. It's really about at any given time, what are the security controls required in the model? So the GC is starting with the building blocks now. Many stages are information gathering, planning, piloting, working in an agile fashion. The time is now to start coordinating resources and plans to collectively approach this change. Data breaches aren't going away, and the threat of cyber attacks are not going to go down. From a security perspective, Zero Trust can better track and block external attackers while limiting security breaches resulting from human error. From a data sharing perspective, Zero Trust can better manage rules for access for users and devices across GC to facilitate secure sharing from the enterprise while providing better service to users. Furthermore, the network design and flexibility of Zero Trust will help the GC more rapidly adapt and implement critical network technologies and enable and enablers ranging from cloud computing to artificial intelligence and machine learning. And lastly, we're here to help. So if you're looking at any of these things and you want to consider them, I'll introduce my team, Imran Bashir and Po T. Duncan. If you don't know them, they're here to engage in these conversations and help you try to move these things forward. Thank you very much.